Hello and welcome to Alex's Model Kits. This is an update on the Millennium Falcon, the fine molds 1 to 144 scale Millennium Falcon that I'm working on at the moment. I did an intro a little while ago talking about my plans for the kit and how I hope to display it, and I mentioned in that video that I wanted to have some lights in the cockpit, and that was really the starting point of the kit in my view. Getting that sorted out and working was kind of the first thing that had to be done before continuing the rest of the kit, and that gave me a number of problems, to be honest. I found some very small LEDs, which I think they're called grain of rice LEDs or grain of wheat LEDs. Very, very small indeed, about a millimetre in length and half a millimetre in width, and they were pretty much ideal for doing this bit of work, because obviously you're working on a very small in a very small area, and the last thing you need to do is to try and cram in large LEDs into that space. It's just not going to work. I had originally thought that I'd have to use the bigger LEDs and then try and paint a lot of reflective surface around the interior of the cockpit to try and reflect light through. But when I found these small LEDs, that pretty much was, straight away, that was an obvious way of going. So I got those, and they were good. They were very effective. They've been very good indeed. They've been quite hard to work with in some ways, because essentially the leads that attach to the LEDs are very, very small indeed, and pretty much they're more like filament than anything else. Very, very fine filament, and quite difficult to bend. They're not very flexible, very, very springy. So you could glue an LED onto a bit of the plastic model kit, and as soon as you took your finger away, the filament would kind of spring it away. Super glue wasn't really any good, because it's such a small piece that you're working with. You ended up sticking it to yourself. So you had to kind of, well, I ended up using PVA, and that's a bit slower in setting. So that was a problem in some ways. And the other issue is that because the leads are so fine, you feel like you have to treat them with a great deal of respect, and you can't really sort of bend them too much for fear of snapping the line inside. So they weren't necessarily easy to work with. Certainly when I first started to work with them, it was quite difficult. I had to solder them onto a larger piece of electronic wiring, and as you solder one filament onto the bit of your electronic lead, as soon as you try and add a second piece, the first piece springs off. So that was quite frustrating, and eventually I got around that by using a couple of clamps to just clamp the filament together, and then using a dab of PVA glue to glue all the filaments into a kind of a clump as well. So that kind of worked quite well. I did try the idea of twisting all the filaments together, but they're so fine and so, well, they feel so fragile that you couldn't really sort of get into it too much for fear of snapping off the exposed filament lead, and if you did that, that's a disaster, because the difference between the actual wire filament and the insulating casing around it is just, you can't see it. So the idea of then stripping that insulating tape away to get more exposed lead was just never going to happen. So so I had to be quite careful working with it, but I did eventually manage to get it wired up, so that I had a electronic wire, just a normal piece of wire, soldered to each part of the filament. I used 8 LEDs eventually, and they all soldered onto that wire. Obviously, you got positive and negative. So with that in place, I then started to work on the cockpit itself, and I found that another challenge came along, which was that the piece that comes with the kit, which is the cockpit interior, it wasn't really up to the job. There were a few things wrong with it in my view. The first was that I didn't really think I could easily sort of place lights around the cockpit area, where the navigator and the engineer sit behind Han Solo and Chewbacca. There was no easy way of lighting that. That was always going to be difficult. I wanted to also put some lights on the rear bulkhead where the door is, because there was lights either side of them. And the original plan was to try and drill with a very small drill, to try and drill some holes through. But the plastic is fairly hard, and that rear bulkhead on the piece itself is quite thick. And I felt that really I was going to end up breaking a lot of drill bits rather than making any holes. So that was a problem as well. It also seemed to me that the console wasn't right. It didn't seem right, and so I felt that that perhaps was an issue as well. And the final thing that was a problem was that I managed to find some 1 to 144 scale World War II pilots. Well, the idea was I would make them into Han, Leia and C-3PO. Chewbacca isn't in that scene at the time. Chewbacca's Han has told him to go out back somewhere and stand by the claw release. So the three of them needed to be in the cockpit, and none of those pilots were sitting in the seats that came with that interior. So really all those reasons ended up just making it obvious that I couldn't use that particular the supplied interior of the cockpit, which meant that I had to scratch build one myself, which I really wasn't keen on doing. I've never scratch built anything, and this seemed like a very bad place to start in my view, because it's so small and so fiddly. The idea of it's just not a good place. It's not a good starting project, I think, in my view, for scratch building. But I had no choice, and so what I decided to do was to try and give myself a fallback plan of not altering the original kit at all, so that if I started doing scratch building and it really wasn't going well, I could always just abandon that and just go for plan B and just use the supplied interior cockpit and just change the whole idea of the project and how it was going to work. So I kept the, this is the supplied piece, which I'll try and show you better here. That is the supplied piece that comes with the kit. And what I then did was I started to make my own basically cockpit floor. Started with the cockpit floor, and there is a cockpit floor, and then I started working on the rear bulkhead, which is here is one rear bulkhead. Now these pieces that I'm showing you are essentially bits that I made and then decided that they weren't good enough, or they weren't quite right. I did actually make, or start to make, a fairly good representation of the cockpit, and then when I started to put the seats in place and then the figures in place, I realised that there's another problem with the original piece, which is that the floor of this piece is too high, and I'd taken that as my guide. I'd made my floor based on the height of their floor, but it's too high, and all the figures were sitting very, very flush, very sort of prominently from over the where the canopy would be. The canopy would never go on with the figures in place, so I had to then make another floor, but basically start again, throw away what I'd done and start again with a brand new floor, and brand new bulkhead, because that had if I left it where it was, there'd be a gap between the bottom of the bulkhead and the floor. That eventually was done, and I then started to put the lighting in. I put 4 lights across the ceiling of the rear of the cockpit. I made a console, a centre console, which I think was much more accurate to the one shown in the films, and I managed to get a light inside there. Then made up some seats, and the final 3 the final 3 lights went at the behind the rear bulkhead, so that there were 2 lights showing for the in the actual Falcon itself. There's a light bar which extends from the rear bulkhead and extends around the side of the cockpit as well, and that provides the main light source for the cockpit. And so I had basically lights behind those light bars, and then 1 light just off to one side, showing some detail of just the small lights and buttons that the cockpit seems to have. And that all seemed to go reasonably well. Well, actually, it went very well. The 2 halves, you know, in the top half I had the 4 lights, and then a sort of full ceiling over those lights with holes drilled in, so that you could see these tiny pinpricks of light coming through. And then behind that you had the bulkhead, which again with pinpricks of light and lights behind. And then on the bottom half I had the cockpit detail, the scratch built cockpit with the cockpit floor, 4 seats, and the console, the console which was lit up, and the figures in their seats, and they all went fine until I came to join the 2 halves together, and I ran into not a big problem, but a problem nonetheless, which was that I'd always been aware that that this is a small area. This is a very small space, a very small and very cramped space. And that really, by adding the lights and doing a lot of work that I'm doing, or I had been doing, what I was going to end up doing was making the space smaller and more cramped. And certainly that's definitely the case. And what ultimately happened, whilst I thought I'd give myself enough space to get everything together, what actually happened was that when I came to finally join the top and the bottom half together, the full ceiling on the top half came down and basically hit C-3PO's head, and that forced him forward. I kind of forced him, if you're kind of looking, if the front of the console is here and you're looking back along the Millennium Falcon, it kind of forced him forward and to one side. That in turn meant that he then pushed Princess Leia, who was standing next to him. He pushed her off to one side, so she was in the centre of the cockpit, leaning forward, and now she's off to one side, still leaning forward. And it also pushed the chair, the empty chair that Chewbacca would sit in, which was level and looked fine. It's now been pushed forward, so it's kind of slant forward. So really, that's quite frustrating. Really, that was a lot of care had been taken to get that sorted out, and a lot of the lighting, it has to be said, a lot of the lighting is not really visible. Now the cockpit's together, you don't really see half the detail that was there. So there you go. You live and learn. I wouldn't say it's a complete disaster. I wouldn't say it's. I'm not completely disappointed with it. I'm reasonably happy with the overall effect. I think it's still better than the original cockpit that came with the kit, but you know, it's just not quite as good as I'd wanted, and that's disappointing. But there you go. So there it is. That's that part finished. The cockpit is now together, and the next stage is to start looking to get the canopy onto the cockpit. I have bought a masking set. So actually, this is. Let's put that like that, shall we? So this is the canopy, the glazing. You've got the 2 circular ones for the 2 turrets at the top and the bottom, and then in the middle you've got the canopy itself for the Falcon. And I've also bought a masking set. Graphic Encounters, high quality pre-cut vinyl masks for the 1/44 scale Millennium Falcon. And it's just a very small pre-cut set. The kit itself does come with a mask. Fine Mods do provide a mask for the kit, but you have to cut it out yourself, which I think I didn't really fancy doing, to be honest. I didn't think that would be a terribly good idea. I thought there was scope for error. there. So I decided I wasn't going to do that, and I found that mask going reasonably cheap and thought I'd get that. Now curiously, oddly, they seem to imply that I should be using water. Yeah, here we go. To aid in positioning of the mask, you may dip each piece into a small dish of water with a drop or two of soap added. We recommend you use distilled water, as tap water can sometimes leave deposits on the canopy. So I don't really understand that. I'm a little puzzled by it. I've never used masks before. This is the first mask I've used, and I'd always assumed that they had their own self-adhesive backing that basically you could just peel off, place on the kit, and that would do the job. So this kind of revelation that it wants water to help it to settle is I find it a bit odd, to be honest. I don't quite understand why it's doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try on one of the windows for the turrets. I'm going to do the masking for that as a test, and that will be the bottom turret because it's not going to be seen. But by the time it's mounted onto the frame, anything that happens there is absolutely not going to be seen. So I do feel I've got quite a good test bed area to use. So I'm going to use that first, test it out, understand what it's doing, and then once I feel I understand what's going on with that mask, I can then mask the top turret and the canopy and make a start on painting the kit. So that's pretty much it for the moment. Hope you found that useful, and I will speak to you again soon with another update. Okay, hope all's good, and see you soon. Bye.